So today, that is indeed the topic of my sermon. And in order for my clothing to match the sermon, I put on these special socks just for you. Those on the front pews might be able to see it, and I'm asking Melanie to zoom in on it for our virtual participants here. Love. It's such a strong word that has that brings about so many feelings, and yet I want to focus again on something that perhaps isn't as glamorous as one of the founding documents of Universalism, which was written over 2 centuries and 2 decades ago, the Winchester Profession of 1803, right? And there are just 3 simple articles to this document. The first one talks about the Bible. So I'm going to quickly skip over that one because the second one is what's interesting to me. It talks about the nature of God being love. And again, I'm going to put a bracket on that because I want to focus on the second part of that profession, which is that there's a restoration of all of humanity towards holiness and happiness. So what does that mean? It means that there is no such thing as hell as a physical location where there is a lake of fire and torment and gnashing of teeth where all the bad people go, right? And again, I want you to think back 222 years ago and how revolutionary that kind of thinking was. And more importantly, what is the implication? If no one's going to go to hell, what does that mean about those who are around us today and how we live our lives? It's kind of unfortunate because I always thought that the whole point of religion was to come up with an industry that provides antidote for all those sinners, right? Like the Catholic Church during the medieval period even capitalized on that by selling indulgences to get people's souls out of hell. All you need to do is contribute large sums of money because somehow that, thank God, is for capitalism, I guess, right? That you could buy your way out of hell. But if there is no such thing as hell, then what are we trying to sell here? Well, how about the whole idea that each person then is lovable and worthy of love? And by implication, this is why the early Universalists partnered with the Quakers to become one of the staunchest proponents of the abolitionist movement. Because by implication, it means that Black people and African Americans are going to join them in heaven someday, so might as well enjoy each other's company now, right? And by implication, it means that women also have dignity and a right to get ordained, for example, which is why the Universalist was one of the first denominations in America to ordain a woman into ministry by the name of the Reverend Olympia Brown in 1863. Can you imagine how early that was to make that strong statement, right? And again, the first African-American Universalist was ordained in 1889 by the name of the Reverend Joseph Jordan. So indeed, and Universalists joined with Unitarians to work, for example, on the suffragist movement and so on and so forth, right? So we could see the implications of having and creating heaven here on earth right this very minute, and what the implications of not having a hell would entail. So the third part of the Winchester Profession talks about, well then, again, yeah, so we're not going to have this threat and punishment looming here, and we are all called to do good anyway, right? So there's a story about Hosea Ballou riding on a horse with a Baptist minister. And the Baptist minister turns to Hosea Ballou and says, well, if there's no punishment for any evil deed that I do, why don't I just go ahead and punch you in the face and knock you over from your horse, and there would be no consequences for that? You know, what would your universalist theology have to say about that? And Hosea Ballou turns to the Baptist minister and says, well, if you're a universalist, the thought wouldn't even occur to you to do such a thing, right? So in other words, you do good just for the hell of it, right? And again, as we discussed earlier, what if our only job and our only responsibility is then to love the hell out of the world? And that is a quote, by the way, by British Universalist George Beneville. And I thought, wow, how radical is that idea, and how hard it is. Like Liz read to us earlier, that love is hard. It's not for wimps, and it's not a namby-pamby kind of love, right? Because let me invite you into this moment, for example, to imagine and think of, close your eyes if you will, of a person so deplorable, whose values is antithetical to yours, and who has probably caused much harm in our world, has caused so much pain and suffering for our world. Imagine this person, and perhaps the color orange comes to mind. Just sit with that for a minute, right? Or I'm thinking of a certain ex, for example. You may be as well, but who knows who that person is? And now open your eyes, and can you just imagine that person not suffering any eternal consequence whatsoever? I know I can't, right? And I know that, and let's take another person. So let's not name names, because, you know, I don't want us to lose our nonprofit 501c3 status here. So let's think about Javert from last week, right? There's this person who is so evil and who's so fixated on arresting Jean Valjean for stealing a frickin' loaf of bread, right, to feed his family. What's up with that guy Javert? You know, to be honest, other than reading the script of what I was supposed to say, I had completely forgotten that he actually grew up in prison, right? So I could only imagine what kind of suffering he went through as a child. And so perhaps the people that we're thinking of similarly experienced trauma and pain while growing up, because who amongst us has had a perfect childhood, right? And if you did, I want your parents. But all of us, I think, in some way or another, have experienced either a lack of sense of belonging or a lack of love somewhere along the way. And so perhaps that's where the compassion comes in, and that's where the empathy comes in, of Javert must have led a very tough life growing up. And then eventually, he found comfort and solace in the letter of the law, right? And how order, like the stars have order, is what helps bring meaning to him and what makes sense out of the world for him. And yet, he missed out, because here's another person that he's trying to arrest named Jean Valjean, who stole that loaf of bread out of a sense of love for his family and trying to feed his sister's daughter and to prevent them from starving. And Jean Valjean also lost track of his life when he came out of prison and thought that the only other thing he knew how to do was to continue stealing. And yet what? He encounters a kind bishop who probably went with the teachings that he knew about, which comes from 1 John 4:19, that says that God is love, and whoever loves God must love one another, right? That we love because God first loved us is probably what the bishop was going with. And so Jean Valjean then took that moment of grace and mercy when the bishop refused to let the police arrest him by saying that, no, he did not steal that silverware, but rather I gave it to him, and he forgot this one other candelabra, right? So take this with you, start your life anew, and that's exactly what Jean Valjean did, and he began to spread the love to everyone that he met, even strangers and prostitutes, people that nobody else would show any love to, any real love to anyway, and made sure that Cosette was taken care of. So he embodied what it meant to love the hell out of the world, to the point where the ending, of course, is a moment, I was talking to Emily about this last week, of I cry every single time I hear that darn epilogue, right? Come with me where chains will never bind you. And I just thought, well, that's one moment that Javert never got to experience throughout the entire book and throughout the entire musical, is that moment of being liberated from one's bondage to the sense of fear and uncertainty and whatever else it was that was limiting Javert to his own cells, ironically enough, that in many ways Javert was the prisoner and Jean Valjean was the one who was set free because love saved him. And he in turn used love to save others. And there's this moment of, the whole idea that love is everlasting. And then there was that duet between Fantine and the bishop at the end that says, to love another person is to see the face of God. That for me was a very powerful moment and a very powerful theology around the power of love to save us. Yes, even the person that we're imagining during that moment of falling beyond the bounds of love. I love a bumper sticker that I came across while driving in West Hollywood one day. It says, Jesus loves you, everyone else thinks you're an a-hole, right? Sorry, I can't cuss in church. And I was like, yeah, there is a different kind of love. Because again, we these days, especially the English language, is so limited when it comes to the word love. Versus the Greeks, for example, who had at least 3 different ways of expressing love. Because more often than not, the love that we think of automatically becomes eros as love, right? So do you swipe right or do you swipe left? That kind of love, But there's other layers of love. There's also philios kind of love, which is brotherly love, pardon the sexist language, but it's more like the love that you would have for a sibling or a friend. And there's this other layer of love called agape love. And that is the love that I think none of us, no mere mortal could understand. I know in my limited thinking, I can never understand the kind of love that would hold even the most quote unquote deplorable among us, right? And to be honest, there were moments in my life when I struggled against a universalist theology and thought that it is so much easier for me to just dismiss someone and say that I'm never gonna see them again, or I never have to encounter them again, and it could be totally disconnected from them. But this agape love is a love so strong that it holds all of us together. The Reverend Rebecca Parker says, there is a love holding us. There is a love holding all that we love. There is a love holding all. We rest in this love. So that kind of love is what we're talking about when we mention the revision to Article 2. And I want to read to you what exactly is being proposed at the upcoming General Assembly about what it means to center love. Love is the power that holds us together and is at the center of our shared values. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love. And so there's a book that just came out last week, edited by the Reverend Dr. Sophia Betancourt, who is our current UUA president. And when I read through it, there were a couple of themes that showed up over and over and over again. Again, this whole framing of love as being in relationship. So there is no such thing as isolated love. Love has to be practiced in relationship to others. And this is why, again, so many of them quoted the scripture passage from 1 John 4 that says, God is love. And the Reverend Dr. Susan Frederick Gray, the former president of the UUA, in her piece, she's a birthright UU, and she was recollecting her childhood days when she would be tucked into bed at night by her loving mother, and she would ask questions like, is there a God? And her mother would say, no, I don't believe there's a God, but I do believe that if there was, God is love. And that's all there is, right? And indeed, when we were doing prayers and public witnessing events during the marriage equality movement in California, my friend and colleague, the Reverend Arvid Straube, used to begin his prayers by saying, God, whose other name is love. And it is really as simple as that, that to love is to be in relationship. And the Reverend Adam Rober-Smith says, love is what allows the world to exist. It is what holds all things together and makes existence coherent. Love is relationship at its best, a way of being that requires relational power, a power that values and respects that which it connects. So not to get all scientific and wonky on you here, but think of love as a neutron in the center of the atom, right? And that neutron is in relationship with the protons and the electrons that are swirling about the neutron, right? So that is the power of love to cohere and hold things together. And again, in this instance, the graphic illustration for the Article 2 core values are in the form of a flower. So what if love at the center is the pistil of that flower, right? What holds all the petals that are surrounding it together, the jet pig. Remember the jet pig from 2 weeks ago? What does it stand for again? Justice, equity, transformation, pluralism, inclusion, and generosity. Yay, I'm glad y'all remembered, because there's a pop quiz afterwards on that. And so, and then another way to look at our core values is, what does core actually mean? In French, or it comes from the French word for heart, right? Le cœur. So core values has to do with our heart, and love is oftentimes seen as emanating from our hearts. And the second common theme with all these articles I read so far from that book is that love is a verb. And again, notice that in Article 2 it says that it's a spiritual discipline, which means that we had to continually practice it. According to Carter Hayward, love is the active realization of relation. God is love, love is God. To God is to love. So not only is love a verb, God is also a verb, right? And so, again, we come around full circle to the Winchester profession, is what I want to end with, in terms of, if we are all to restore humanity towards holiness or wholeness and happiness, we gotta, each and every single moment of our lives, love the hell out of this world. Can I get an amen to that? All right, thank you.
Hi, welcome to Getting the Message. My name is Kerwin Seeger. I am the acting religious education assistant at Fourth U, and I'm joined by Reverend Jonipher. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Kerwin, for asking. And how are you?
I'm doing well.
Good.
I'm still riding the high from last week's youth-led service, which was
my gosh,
great.
It was amazing, wasn't it?
It was so fun. So this service is a bit of a continuation, a bit of a reflection on last week's service and love and that topic. Can you talk a little bit about the ties that way we might see from the youth-led service to today's service?
Sure. So I figured last week we didn't really get a chance to unpack it much. It was, fabulous, and everybody shone and everybody did a great job. And I wanted to explore this whole theme more of what does it mean to love? And as I mentioned earlier, what does it mean to draw a distinction between the letter of the law, which Javert seemed fixated on, versus the spirit of the law, right? And how do we navigate our way around the two? And let's talk a little bit more, and I did earlier, about Jean Valjean's love and his redemption story and how he got to a place where he was able to open up himself more, and I know that he stole that loaf of bread initially out of love for his family and to feed them, right? But later on, that love extended to strangers like Fantine and the guy who got stuck behind beneath the horse carriage, right?
Oh, yes.
Forgot his name. Did he even actually have a name, or
I don't think he did. I think it was
the dude that got stuck below the carriage. So it's a great way to practice and live into love, which is, I think, what we're called to do as Unitarian Universalists. And so that's what I wanted to explore today, is how that theme could carry over, because as you know, we're spending the month of May talking about Article 2 revisions, and a couple of weeks ago we talked about the other parts of the pedal, the jet pig part, right? The justice, equity, transformation, pluralism, and inclusion, and generosity aspect of Article 2. So now we're getting to the core of it, to the center, to the pistil, to the nucleus, so to speak, of what our core values are. And again, it's interesting that the word core even comes from French for le cœur, or the heart. And we also describe love as coming from the heart, right? So core values, the heart, love, what better way to tie it all in?
Yeah, totally. So that's really great. You spoke about things coming from the heart and kind of radiating out, both for people that you know, strangers, and the world as a whole. And you mentioned loving the hell out of the world.
Yes.
Can you maybe talk a little bit about the meaning behind that phrase? Because I know for a lot of people coming from different faiths outside of Unitarian Universalism, hell has a very specific connotations that we as UUs don't necessarily subscribe to. So hearing hell in Fourth U is whatever the UU version of blasphemy is.
Indeed. And, even if you go back to biblical times, and by the way, I didn't come up with that phrase, loving the hell out of the world. I wish I could claim credit for it, but since I can't find original sources, I just kind of quoted it. But the word hell itself and the whole idea of it is actually a misconception, because if you look back at the Bible, it's a physical location outside of Jerusalem where they burned the trash, basically, right? So it has become associated with this place of fire and brimstone and all of that. And again, as I mentioned during my sermon, isn't it easier for us to send those who we don't like necessarily to a place of eternal damnation, right? And I don't know if you've seen the show Lucifer from Netflix, but I love their take on it. Because at first, initially, I thought that show was going to be about the traditional notion of hell, but later on, they recreated it to mean like an endless loop of suffering of your own doing that somehow you recreate it through your own sense of guilt and shame. And so for me, that's probably closer to my definition of hell, which is a state of mind and a state of being that either you or society puts you in. So what better way to deconstruct that state of being and state of mind than to use the antidote to hell, which is love, right? And to, again, practice what it means to show kindness and compassion on a daily basis, so that we don't approach it from this shame or guilt-based kind of theology, but rather a positive theology, which is, again, what universal salvation is about. So, which is where we got the word universalism from, right? Of that, what if everybody were saved? What if that was the starting point of our theology? How else would everything else flow from that? And a natural conclusion would be there is no hell as a physical location, because if you have a God of love, how could that God send anyone to an eternal place of suffering and damnation? And so, like I mentioned earlier, we just got to figure out how to get along now in this life, right? Instead of waiting for some eternal consequence or eternal punishment further down the road.
Amazing. Yet another transition. We talk about all the transitions of mindset. There's a lot of transitions at Fourth U today.
We're transitioning away from hell?
Yes.
What are you talking about? I want to talk about hell somewhere. Just kidding, guys.
Transitioning in the UUA. So with all of the transitions going on in the world, both locally within the UU Church, but also broadly, I don't think anyone would disagree saying that the world is in a time of change right now, and it's very transient.
Yeah.
How do we center love through times of change?
Well, even times of non-change, which doesn't exist, of course, because we're always in a time of transition, right? And again, change is inevitable, but transformation is optional. And our reaction to the division in the world, to all the suffering that is going on, that is up to us to decide. And I think for Unitarian Universalists, we often get stuck in this whole idea of individual salvation and how can I myself experience transformation, or what can I do personally? But I feel like, again, we need to take a look at this from a collective perspective of how can we engage in acts of love. And this is part of why we have a postcarding effort here at Fourth Universalist, for example, right? So that a group of people, like what happened not this past Thursday, but 2 Thursdays ago, there were 60 people here.
It was a great event.
Yeah, you were here for that, right?
I was not, but I saw the pictures of it.
Yeah, and you saw the pictures. So we had people from the ethical culture, from West End Synagogue, from All Souls. There were 60 who were gathered here to write love letters, in essence, right? Encouraging people to vote, encouraging people to get involved, encouraging especially those who live in historically marginalized communities, that even if you're African American or Latinx, or whatever your racial or class background is, you have this power in front of you called voting, and we as religious institutions could actually engage in that effort without telling people how to vote. We just want to make sure that they engage in the democratic process, which again is part of our core values and part of our principles. And so acts of kind, again, I keep going back to that. How could we actualize love? Because love is a verb. It's not just a noun or a lofty ideal that we put out here, but rather it's the day-to-day things that we do that makes a difference, and that's what causes transformation. And I believe that with our collective power and our collective ability to love, we could unleash this force out into the universe, right? So that's what's so powerful about it.
Of course. What a powerful way to end. So leaving you all with a force of love. So thank you for sitting down with me and talking about getting the message this week.
Thanks, Kerwin. That was fun.
Yes.
And we'll be back next week.
Yeah, we'll be back next week.
Well, actually, you will be.
I will be.
I won't be. So,
have a great week, everyone.